The veteran had boarded the plane the same way he approached most things in life, quietly, respectfully, without needing attention or recognition. He found his assigned seat, tucked his small carry-on under the seat in front of him, and sat with the calm of someone who had spent years learning how to stay composed no matter what was happening around him. Nothing about him demanded a second glance. He wasn't wearing ribbons or medals, just a worn jacket and the kind of posture that hinted at discipline built over decades. To most people, he looked like any other traveler trying to get where he needed to go. But underneath that simple exterior was a man who had served his country with a level of commitment that shaped every part of who he was. As passengers shuffled down the aisle, the usual frustrations of air travel filled the cabin. Overhead bins crammed too quickly, elbows bumping armrests, the soft rumble of people negotiating for space. Nobody was paying much attention to the small scene forming a few rows in. At first, it was just the soft but firm voice of a flight attendant addressing the veteran. Her tone wasn't angry, but it carried the kind of authority that made people turn their heads. She told him he needed to move seats. No explanation, no apology. Just an instruction delivered with the assumption that he would comply without question. The veteran looked up, surprised. He checked his boarding pass instinctively, as if he'd somehow misread something. He hadn't. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. He answered politely, pointing to his seat number, thinking maybe there had been a simple mistake. But the flight attendant shook her head and repeated the directive, this time with a sharper edge. There was no real justification. Only vague words about accommodation that didn't match the situation. The request wasn't about safety or logistics or policy. It felt arbitrary and dismissive, and it put an unnecessary spotlight on someone who clearly didn't want to make a scene. The passengers around him went still. A few shifted uncomfortably. They could see he wasn't causing trouble. They could see he was being put in a position he didn't deserve. But the social pressure of an airplane is powerful. People don't like to interfere, especially when they're trapped in tight rows with no privacy and no real authority. Most pretended to focus on their phones or seatbelts, all while listening closely. The silence in that part of the cabin carried more weight than any argument could. The veteran didn't argue back. That wasn't who he was. Years of discipline were etched into the way he held his hands, the way he breathed, the way he processed things he couldn't control. Instead of snapping or demanding respect, he nodded once, quietly, and gathered his belongings. There was something dignified about the way he moved, even though the situation was inherently undignified. His bag wasn't heavy, but the moment was, and everyone around him felt that weight, even if they didn't know his story or his rank or the sacrifices he had made in his life. The flight attendant stood waiting in the aisle, her impatience growing more visible as the seconds ticked by. She didn't ask if he needed help. She didn't check whether he had mobility issues or back problems or anything else that might make abrupt seat changes difficult. She simply stood there, arms slightly crossed, ushering him along like an inconvenience rather than a person. The people nearby watched his face as he stood. There was no anger, only that quiet, steady look carried by people who have handled far worse than this. But there was also something else, something subtle, an expression that suggested he was used to being overlooked, used to being misunderstood, used to swallowing moments like this. He stepped into the aisle with the kind of care that comes from respecting other people's space, even when he wasn't being given the same courtesy. Passengers pulled their knees in and tried to make room. A few offered sympathetic eyes, the kind that said, without words, that they knew this wasn't right. The aisles suddenly felt longer, the walk heavier, the entire plane too small for the tension settling over the rows. And through all of it, the veteran moved forward without complaint, without pushback, without asking for anything. Not recognition, not apology, not even fairness. Passengers didn't talk about what happened, but their silence said enough. The moment the veteran stood up, the energy in the cabin shifted. People sank back into their seats, eyes flicking up only long enough to confirm what they already felt, that something about the interaction was off. A few passengers exchanged quick glances with the kind of communication that happens without words, a raised eyebrow, a slight frown, the small shake of a head that says, "Did that really just happen?" But no one spoke, because that's what happens in cramped spaces thousands of feet above the ground. People retreat into themselves, even when they know they've just witnessed something unfair. The narrow aisle gave everyone front row seats to a situation no one wanted to be part of. They weren't sure whether to step in or stay silent, and most chose the path of least resistance. A woman across the aisle pretended to adjust the air vent just so she wouldn't look directly at the veteran while he lifted his bag. A man scrolling on his phone slowed down his movements, reading the same notification twice because he couldn't focus. Someone 2 rows back tugged at his earbuds but didn't put them in. He wanted to hear what was happening, even if he acted like he wasn't paying attention. Every sound felt too loud in that moment. The click of the overhead bin, the rustle of fabric as the veteran shifted, the clipped footsteps of the flight attendant. Even the hum of the plane seemed to dim, as if the aircraft itself sensed the tension. The whole cabin became a stage, and the people seated in those rows became reluctant witnesses to a scene that carried more weight than they expected when they boarded. It wasn't that anyone believed the veteran was causing a problem. Quite the opposite. That was what made the moment feel so wrong. He had boarded quietly, followed instructions, stayed in his assigned seat, and kept to himself. He didn't demand special treatment. He didn't mention his service or try to leverage it for comfort or attention. The only thing that set him apart was the way he carried himself, with a kind of calm that suggested he'd been through worse situations and learned to handle them without complaint. And that calm made the abrupt instruction for him to move even more jarring. Some passengers began replaying the moment in their minds, trying to figure out if they had missed something. Had there been a mix-up with seat assignments? Had they overlooked a legitimate reason he needed to shift? But the more they thought about it, the clearer it became. There had been no clear explanation, no courtesy, no attempt to justify the disruption. The veteran hadn't been treated like a person whose comfort mattered. He had been treated like a problem to remove quickly so the flight could continue without delay. One young woman in a window seat pressed her lips together, visibly uncomfortable. She had seen his eyes when the flight attendant repeated the order. There was no anger in them, just a quiet kind of resignation. That expression stuck with her because it didn't look like the reaction of someone surprised or confused. It looked like someone who had learned to accept being overlooked far too often. That bothered her more than the situation itself. It told her this wasn't the first time someone had spoken to him without thought or respect. Others felt the tension building but didn't know what to do with it. They shifted in their seats, adjusted seatbelts, smoothed out blankets, found distractions. But every distraction was thin. The moment lingered in the air, heavy and unavoidable. They watched the veteran take a breath, not deep or dramatic, just enough to steady himself before stepping into the aisle. It was the kind of breath people take when they want to move past something quietly. The discomfort wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, spreading across rows like a cold draft. Some passengers felt guilty for staying silent. Others felt frustrated at the powerlessness that comes with being a bystander. A few rationalized the situation in their minds to ease the tension. Asterisk, maybe the attendant knows something we don't. Maybe there's a policy. Asterisk, but even those thoughts felt thin because the tone of the interaction didn't match a simple, reasonable misunderstanding. It carried the unmistakable weight of someone being treated unfairly without explanation. The cabin wasn't angry. It was unsettled, uneasy, aware. People might not have known the veteran's name, his age, his rank, or his story, but they recognized dignity when they saw it. And they recognized disrespect when it was right in front of them. They watched him shift down the aisle, not with frustration or entitlement, but with quiet acceptance, and that acceptance made the injustice feel sharper. Even the people who tried not to look still felt the moment press against them, a silent reminder that witnessing unfairness is its own kind of discomfort, one that lingers longer than expected. The captain wasn't the kind of person who missed things happening in his aircraft. Even from the cockpit, where switches clicked and screens pulsed with routine data, he could sense shifts in the cabin the way an experienced driver feels a change in the engine. Pilots hear the subtle details most passengers never notice. tones in the crew's voices, pauses that don't belong, footsteps that carry tension instead of momentum. So when the flight attendant returned to the front of the plane with stiff shoulders and short breaths, he picked up on it right away. She didn't announce a problem, but something in the way she moved told him there was more happening behind her than a simple boarding delay. Pilots rely on communication to keep everything running smoothly. They expect updates about seating issues, passenger conflicts, and anything out of the ordinary before the doors close. That's why the captain tilted his head slightly when he heard a quick, hushed exchange between the attendant and another crew member. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop. He simply noticed. Years of flying had sharpened his instincts, and those instincts told him that whatever had happened wasn't a typical seat dispute. The tone was too clipped, the words too vague, the energy too unsettled for something trivial. He kept doing his pre-flight checks, but he listened. Airline cockpits are not sealed-off worlds. Sound carries, especially when tension rides on it. He caught fragments of sentences, asked him to move, didn't question it, just went. None of it fit into any standard procedure he knew. Seat changes happen all the time, but the crew usually explains why. They give details, context, reassurance. This didn't sound like that. It sounded like something handled too quickly and without care. The captain leaned back in his seat for a moment, scanning the instrument panel while letting his mind parse what he had just heard. He didn't know who him was. He didn't know why the move had been ordered, but he knew something felt off, and he trusted that instinct. Pilots don't ignore the feeling that something isn't right. They are trained to investigate, to ask questions, to make sure every part of the aircraft, mechanical and human, is balanced before takeoff. He clicked his mic, calmly asking the lead attendant for a brief update before they closed the cabin door. The tone of his request wasn't sharp, but it carried authority, the kind that comes from thousands of hours in the cockpit and the responsibility of every life on board. The pause that followed told him even more than the answer that came back. A real issue with seating would have been explained immediately, but instead he got a hesitation, a soft, "I'll check," and the sound of footsteps moving away. When the lead attendant finally returned, her explanation was thin. Something about accommodating another passenger, something about needing that specific seat, something about the veteran being moved because it was easier that way. But the captain heard what wasn't said. He heard the uncertainty behind her words, the discomfort she didn't hide well enough. And then he heard one detail that changed the weight of the entire interaction, the word veteran. Not because pilots treat veterans differently out of obligation, but because respect is a core part of aviation culture. The cockpit is a place where service, discipline, and sacrifice are understood deeply. He didn't need a full story to recognize that the situation had not been handled with respect. He could tell the attendant was trying to move past it quickly, but he didn't operate on quick fixes. He operated on clarity. He operated on integrity. So he asked more questions, not confrontational ones, not accusatory ones, just straightforward, steady inquiries that made it clear he expected real information. What was the reason? Was the veteran disruptive? Was there a policy conflict? Was there a safety concern? Each answer came back thinner than the last until it was clear there was no good reason at all. The veteran had simply complied without causing trouble, and the attendant had simply insisted without explaining. The captain sat in silence for a moment after hearing this, letting the reality of it settle. In an aircraft, fairness matters. Respect matters. The smallest actions echo through the cabin, shaping the environment for every passenger on board. He reached over to double-check the paper manifest, noting the seat change. Nothing on it justified what he had been told. He imagined the scene, the quiet man standing, gathering his belongings, walking down the aisle while people watched. Even without seeing it, he could sense the weight of it. Something in him tightened, not with anger, but with conviction. This wasn't how things should run on his aircraft. This wasn't the tone he wanted to set before the wheels even left the ground. He didn't slam switches or raise his voice. He simply breathed, straightened in his seat, and made a decision. The aircraft had already begun its slow crawl away from the gate, that familiar rumble moving through the floorboards as the engines spooled up to taxi speed. Passengers settled in, buckling belts, adjusting headrests, preparing themselves for the transition from ground to sky. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but in the cockpit, the captain's mind wasn't following the usual rhythm. He couldn't let the earlier exchange go. It wasn't dramatic or chaotic, but it carried a quiet wrongness that lingered. Pilots know the difference between a minor inconvenience and a situation that demands attention, and this one refused to fade into the background. He watched the yellow taxiway lights slide past the windows as he guided the plane toward the line of aircraft waiting for takeoff. The crew performed their standard cross-checks. The radio crackled with instructions from the tower. Everything in his training told him to remain focused on procedure, timing, and safety, but focus doesn't erase responsibility. Responsibility expands to include whatever affects the atmosphere on board, and he knew the tone of the cabin wasn't right. He replayed the thin explanation the flight attendant had given him. It didn't sit well. There had been no operational need for the veteran to move, no policy issue that required a relocation, no safety concern that justified the disruption. And the more the captain thought about the man who had been displaced, the more certain he became that the moment demanded more than quiet disapproval from the cockpit. Doing nothing meant accepting something that went against the core of how he believed people should be treated on his aircraft. He slowed the taxi subtly, not abruptly, not enough for passengers to feel alarmed, but enough to buy a few more seconds to think clearly. The co-pilot glanced over, but didn't question it. He trusted the captain's judgment. The captain scanned the taxiway ahead, then rested his hand on the throttle with intention rather than routine. His decision was already forming, solidifying with each passing yard. The intercom button sat just inches from his fingertips. He didn't reach for it yet. Instead, he took a moment to picture the cabin as it must have been. The quiet veteran rising without protest, the uncomfortable glances from nearby seats, the pressure of silence trapping everyone between wanting to act and fearing it would make things worse. He imagined that long walk down the aisle, the weight of dignity held tight, even when dignity wasn't being offered in return. The image was enough to push him past hesitation. He signaled to the tower. His voice was calm, steady, professional, nothing in his tone revealing what he was about to do. He requested a pause before joining the takeoff line. The tower acknowledged without question, granting him a brief hold that pilots rarely request unless something important requires attention. The plane eased to a stop, and the hum of the engines stabilized into a softer vibration. Passengers looked around, some thinking it was a routine delay. The captain knew better. Inside the cockpit, the moment felt heavier than the pause itself. Stopping a plane on the taxiway isn't dramatic, but it's deliberate. It means the captain is taking ownership of something that can't wait until cruising altitude or landing. It means something in the cabin has crossed the line of simple inconvenience and entered the realm of principle. He finally pressed the intercom button, not to make a public announcement yet, but to call the lead attendant to the front of the plane. His tone wasn't harsh. It didn't need to be. Authority in an aircraft doesn't come from volume. It comes from clarity. When she arrived, he didn't lecture. He asked one question, simple and direct. Was there any legitimate operational reason the veteran needed to be moved? Not a convenient reason. Not a preferred reason. A legitimate one. She hesitated. Not because she was searching for the truth, but because she already knew it. The silence that followed was enough. The captain didn't sigh or shake his head. He just turned his attention back to the controls, not to advance, but to stay exactly where they were. Outside, another aircraft rolled past them, its lights casting a brief glow across the captain's window. He watched it go, then shifted his focus inward again. He didn't stop the plane out of anger. He stopped it because moments like this define leadership more than any perfect landing or smooth climb ever could. He understood that the atmosphere on a plane affects everyone on board, and allowing disrespect, even quiet, subtle disrespect, to stand unaddressed undermined the integrity he worked to uphold every single day. The engines continued their soft rumble beneath his feet, waiting for his next move. The plane was still, but the decision had already been set in motion. The lead attendant stood near the cockpit door, unsure of what the captain would do next. She had given her explanation, and the silence that followed made it clear the captain wasn't satisfied with it. But he didn't argue with her, didn't raise his voice, didn't reprimand her in front of the crew. He simply nodded once, a small gesture that carried more weight than any confrontation could. She stepped back into the cabin, not yet realizing the captain had already decided what needed to happen. He wasn't going to let the incident pass as just another uncomfortable moment brushed under the rug. Not on his aircraft. The aircraft remained paused on the taxiway. Passengers shifted in their seats, puzzled but not alarmed. Some assumed it was a clearance issue. Others thought another plane ahead of them needed more time. No one expected what was coming, not even the co-pilot, who gave the captain a questioning look but trusted him enough not to ask. Pilots learn to read each other without words, and he understood that the captain was weighing something more than airspace and timing. The captain sat with his hands resting lightly near the controls, but his attention was on the intercom. He knew exactly what he wanted to say. He wasn't rehearsing a speech or trying to craft the perfect message. He just wanted to speak truthfully, clearly, and with the respect the moment deserved. Before he pressed the button, he took 1 second, just one, to steady the weight of leadership that came with what he was about to do. Then he reached forward and activated the cabin microphone. The soft chime of the intercom echoed through the airplane. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People turned toward the speaker panels overhead. Passengers expected to hear standard instructions, maybe a quick update about a delay or a reminder to stay seated. Instead, they heard a voice that carried intention far beyond routine announcements. The captain began with the simplest words, an acknowledgement that they had paused their taxi and that he wanted to address something before continuing. His tone was calm, grounded, unmistakably sincere. There was no frustration in his voice, no hurry, no trace of annoyance. Just purpose. He explained that earlier, a veteran on board had been asked to move from his assigned seat. He didn't mention the attendant's tone. He didn't detail the awkwardness witnessed by passengers. He didn't assign blame. He simply stated the truth, that the man had been displaced without a valid reason. A quiet ripple moved through the cabin. People leaned forward slightly, listening more closely. The captain spoke with a kind of clarity that pulled everyone's attention into the same shared space. He said that on his aircraft, respect mattered, fairness mattered, and honoring those who had served was not something he took lightly. Still, his words weren't preachy or sentimental. They were steady, grounded, and delivered like someone who understood the weight of service because he carried responsibility every day himself. Then he did something no one expected. He asked the veteran to stand, not because he wanted to embarrass him, but because he wanted to recognize him openly. His voice softened when he invited the man to step into the aisle. He didn't rush him, didn't push him, didn't make it feel like a command. It was an invitation wrapped in respect. The cabin remained incredibly quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like everyone is holding their breath at the same time. The veteran rose slowly, the same way he had earlier, except this time the energy around him wasn't tense or uncomfortable. It was reverent. He stepped into the aisle, uncertain of what was happening yet composed in that quiet, disciplined way he carried himself. People watched him with a different expression now, one shaped not by discomfort, but by admiration. Heads turned. Hands that had been fidgeting stopped. Even the engine hum felt like it softened around the moment. The captain continued speaking. He thanked the veteran for his service, not with dramatic flair, but with steady gratitude. He acknowledged the sacrifice behind the uniform, the commitment that outlived active duty, the kind of character that shows up in the smallest moments. And then, without theatrics, he offered him something simple but significant, his own seat. The captain's seat, the one reserved for the leader of the aircraft. The gesture wasn't about luxury. It was about honoring the veteran in a way that reflected genuine respect rather than empty courtesy. Gasps and quiet murmurs stirred across the cabin. People weren't shocked because of extravagance. They were moved because of intention. The captain didn't have to do it. No policy required it. No rule encouraged it. He chose it because leadership is measured not by authority, but by how that authority is used. The co-pilot stepped in immediately, ready to take command if the captain had to step out. The cockpit door stood open for a moment. bridging the gap between the place where decisions are made and the place where people feel their impact. The captain waited until the murmur calmed, then ended his announcement with a clear, respectful acknowledgement of the veteran's presence on board. There were no cheers, no applause, just a deep, collective stillness, the kind that happens when people witness something meaningful. The plane had stopped on the taxiway, but something else had moved forward. The tone of the entire flight, the mood of the passengers, the dignity restored to a man who had carried himself with grace even when grace wasn't initially offered. For a moment after the captain's announcement, the cabin stayed completely still, the kind of stillness that doesn't feel empty at all. It felt full of emotion, full of understanding, full of the quiet recognition that something meaningful had just shifted in the space they were all sharing. People who had been sunk into their seats now sat up straighter. Those who had tried not to get involved earlier found themselves pulled directly into the heart of the moment, whether they meant to be or not. The tension that had hung over the rows like a heavy curtain began to lift in a way that felt almost physical. The veteran, still standing in the aisle, didn't move quickly. He wasn't the type to rush, especially when he wasn't sure how to respond to such a public acknowledgement. His hands tightened slightly at his sides, not out of nervousness, but because he wasn't used to being the center of attention. People weren't staring at him out of curiosity anymore. Their looks carried respect, unspoken, but unmistakable. A few passengers gave small nods, subtle gestures of appreciation that didn't intrude on the moment but added warmth to it. Someone in the middle rows instinctively placed a hand over their heart. Another passenger looked away for a second, blinking a bit more than usual. A man near the back straightened his posture, almost mirroring the veteran's stance without realizing why. These small reactions formed a quiet chain across the cabin, connecting strangers through a shared feeling that none of them had expected to experience on an ordinary flight. The flight attendant who had asked the veteran to move earlier stood frozen near the galley, her expression shifting in ways she probably didn't expect anyone to notice. There was surprise there, and maybe a hint of regret, but mostly there was awareness of how different the moment looked now compared to earlier, awareness of the man she had spoken to so abruptly, and awareness of the impact a single action can have when it's done without care. She didn't step forward, didn't speak, but the atmosphere around her softened as the cabin transformed. The captain's words had changed not just the veteran's experience, but everyone's perspective. People began seeing the man not as a displaced passenger, but as someone worthy of honor, someone whose quiet presence demanded respect without ever asking for it. The acknowledgement from the cockpit reframed everything. It reminded the passengers that dignity doesn't always announce itself with medals or uniforms. Sometimes it sits quietly in row 14, hands folded, waiting for a moment to simply pass without causing trouble. The co-pilot, now preparing to guide the aircraft forward again when the captain returned, glanced into the cabin for a brief moment. Even from the cockpit door, he could feel the shift, a subtle warmth replacing the earlier unease. It was rare to see a cabin so unified in emotion. He didn't interrupt. He closed the door gently, giving the moment space to breathe. The veteran finally took a small step forward, not toward the cockpit, but just enough to acknowledge the passengers around him. A few people offered soft applause, not loud, not disruptive, just a sprinkling of appreciation that rose and fell almost immediately, as if they didn't want to overwhelm him. Others stayed silent, believing the quiet meant more than any noise could. It didn't matter whether they clapped or didn't. The emotion was the same. People who hadn't noticed him when he first boarded now couldn't imagine how they overlooked him. They saw him clearly. They saw the humility in the way he held himself, the steadiness in his movements, the reluctance to accept special attention even when it was offered with sincere respect. The cabin no longer felt strained or disconnected. It felt unified, like everyone was breathing in the same rhythm again. A woman in the front row leaned slightly into the aisle, giving him a soft smile. A young man who had been irritated about the delay earlier now felt something completely different, a kind of grounding, a reminder that small inconveniences mean nothing compared to the weight some people carry silently. Even children sensed the shift. One little girl whispered to her mother, asking if the man was a hero. The mother didn't answer immediately, but her expression said enough. The energy in the cabin wasn't loud or celebratory. It was reverent. It held a sense of gratitude that didn't need to be spoken out loud. The mood had traveled a long way from discomfort to respect, from quiet tension to shared understanding. And the change didn't feel forced or dramatic. It felt natural, like the moment everyone had needed without realizing it. As the veteran remained in the aisle, passengers looked at him with the kind of regard that can't be manufactured. It wasn't pity or sympathy. It was acknowledgement, clear, simple, and honest. A man who had been treated unfairly minutes earlier was now standing in a space filled with appreciation. The shift wasn't about correcting a mistake or smoothing over an awkward interaction. It was about restoring something deeper, something that had been disrupted, the recognition of a person's worth. The cabin felt lighter, not because the situation had been resolved perfectly, but because it had been addressed with integrity. The respect in the air didn't fade quickly. It lingered, settling into the rows, into the expressions, into the breaths people took. It was the kind of atmosphere that stays with passengers long after the plane takes off, long after it lands, long after the day moves on.